Characteristics of the victim. The level of physiological or psychological trauma is subjective. That's important. So the psychological and physiological effects on a victim are subjective. They're dependent upon the age, the idea of the brain development. The hippocampus volume is reduced by 8%. Short-term memory loss. Gender, females tend to have more significant response, and the socioeconomic level also varies with the characteristics of the victim. So if these are all pretty good, if the brain is mostly developed, if the victim copes well, they have mostly we're talking about good coping strategies. This is obviously resilience, the ability to cope with adversity and return to healthy functioning after a traumatic event. So this includes the beliefs, the behaviors, the skill, and attitudes necessary to regain one's assumptive world. So I think there are probably more slides about this, but generally we all have a worldview and we have an idea of how we fit into that worldview. And when we're victimized, that worldview gets blown apart, basically. Okay. And these are the components of resilience. If a person has a propensity for healthy coping, if they're optimistic, if they have a healthy level of self-knowledge, in other words, not neurotic, they have the ability to find meaning in life experiences. That's important because when your worldview gets shattered, then it's hard to find a meaning in that. Why did this happen? Why did that happen to me? Why did that happen now? And the ability to build and maintain healthy relationships. That's really important. And it's important because a lot of times victims will withdraw and isolate themselves, and or associates of the victim will withdraw from them, thinking that, okay, if I get too close, then what's going to happen is that I will be a victim, which obviously is faulty thinking. And let's talk a little bit about assumptive world. Assumptive world is strongly held sets of beliefs about the world and our place in the world that's used to recognize, plan, and act. So you can predict sort of what's going to happen and then plan and act accordingly. So crime, these are common beliefs. Crime happens, but not to me for these reasons. We can control and are inherently responsible for what happens to us. If I do A, B, and C, I'll never become a crime victim. And when victimization occurs, the assumptive worldview has failed. Victim blaming. Normal response to crime is fear. More terrified that crime is committed against them. This is acquaintances or associates of the victim. These are the traits that they carry. So the normal response to crime is fear. The more terrified that the crime is committed against them, they isolate the victim. And there are two theories that are involved here. One is invulnerability, and the other is that we live in a just world. So I'm not vulnerable, and the world is just, and I'm not vulnerable because I'm doing X, Y, and Z, etc. Okay, so what happens in terms of the physiological response to victimization? You have a normal memory, and it kind of looks like this. You've got memory about how to get to school, memory about how to fix potato salad, etc. All these memories, but they're all kind of contained in one place. But what happens in terms of a response to trauma happens in a couple of different phases. One is the impact or the crisis phase, and the other is the adjustment phase. The response to crisis and trauma, everything gets scattered. Your worldview is shattered so that what you saw, what you felt, what the sounds that were made, the taste, the smell, etc. These aren't all connected to this one event. They're all shattered. They're all spread apart. So what you heard doesn't necessarily match what you saw or what you smelled, etc. And the crisis phase, these are characteristics of that. Denial, avoidance, minimalization, oh, it wasn't that big a deal. Loss of appetite or overeating, vomiting, insomnia, excessive sleeping, either one of the ends of the continuum, shock, numbness, crying. In the crisis phase, this is what happens right at first. Hyperventilation, the ability to breathe, guilt, self-blame, isolation, loneliness, fear, shame, withdrawal from social situations and the need to be with other people, the avoidance of sexual situations or hypersexuality. You'll notice that on a continuum, both ends. So the idea here is there'll be an excessive amount of something. Adjustment phase. Adjustment phase begins about 2 weeks after the event or the awareness of the event. The memories are generally stored in long-term memory as opposed to short-term memory. Common triggers are identification of an assailant, seeing something similar to the situation of the crime, news accounts, anniversaries of the crime, etc. Reorganization, integration, and resolution. This is when the victim begins to adjust their worldview. Life stabilizes a little bit more, and the victim will have created a new assumptive world or a new worldview. And this doesn't just happen like in a moment. It happens over time, little by little, moment by moment. One of the long-lasting effects is the post-traumatic stress disorder. This happens after a traumatic event. There's a persistent re-experiencing of the event in your mind. There's loss of sleep, anxiety, difficulty planning. It's like there's this tape that's running in the victim's mind over and over again, like the event is happening over and over again. There's a persistence avoidance of triggers. So if it happened when you were eating at Burger King, then you're not going to go to Burger King again because that would be a trigger. Hypervigilance, exaggerated responses. So someone taps you on the shoulder, you react with fear. The cycle of violence. Okay, this is especially important when you're talking about domestic violence. You start out and everything is cool, and then the honeymoon, oh, he or she is so wonderful, my Prince Charming, etc. And then things begin to fall apart and tension begins to build. And it builds and it builds and it builds. And then something happens that's the last straw and the violence occurs. And then, well, on this slide it doesn't show, but there's usually a remorse phase as well. I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And obviously they do it again. The Stockholm Syndrome, the person perceives what's happened as a threat to their survival. And so if I identify with the offender, if they show any kind of kindness to me, then maybe it won't be so bad. I won't be so isolated and I can't escape. So the whole thing is set up for the victim relying on the offender for basically everything. That's the Stockholm Syndrome. And then we have secondary victims. This is especially common with intimate partners. If the husband gets beaten up at a bar, then the wife is going to experience some of the victim characteristics. They might experience similar or separate different symptoms. And the secondary victim will also generally feel guilt, anger, and frustration. And this is especially common in parents after their child becomes a victim. Okay, that's it. So I am going to see if I can get this posted on YouTube. Okay, have a good week.